waited for many years, which is the collected journalism of Seepersad Naipaul, published under the title Amazing Scenes. I'm just here to give you a very brief welcome, and I'm very shortly going to hand over to Jeremy Poynting, who is both the publisher of the book, as the publisher and editor of Peepal Tree Press, and the sort of host and interlocutor for the afternoon. But we have some surprises. If you've looked at your program, you know that we have the three of the editors of the book here on stage with us. But we also have, thanks to Ken Ramchand and his foresight and planning, some guest readers from some of Trinidad and Tobago's most exciting contemporary writers. So this is going to be a really action-packed session, amazing scenes indeed. And it feels appropriate to be doing this a block away from the Trinidad Guardian building on St. Vincent Street, where Seepersad Naipaul worked for many years, and in fact across the street from the Red House, where Nivedita Naipaul worked for a while before he left Trinidad. All I really need to say to you is that I was probably an undergraduate, so quite a few years ago, when I heard Professor Ken Ramchand use the phrase lost literature, talking about the lost literature of the Caribbean. And I recently heard the literary critic Alison Donnell use a different term, the unfound literature of the Caribbean. So Ken, I think I've been talking about the lost literature for so long, but I think I'm going to start talking about the unfound literature, because that suggests it's not permanently lost. We just haven't refound it as yet. This is a prime example of the unfound literature of the Caribbean, a body of writing by an important Trinidadian writer, important in his own right, and important as the head of what is essentially a literary dynasty, the Naipaul literary dynasty, which has been trapped in archives, newspaper archives, for close to a century. And thanks to the very hard work of the 4 editors of the book, it's being given back to us. I say 4 editors of the book because I also want to start, and I'm sure Ken and others will mention it, I also want to start by mentioning that the 4th editor of the book is not here with us this afternoon. That's because the 4th editor was Professor Breanne Mc Ivor, who died last year. Put a lot of work into this book, as a very close colleague of Ken Ramchand and the friends of Mr. Biswas. And we just did an event in the AV room where we talked about Breanne Mc Ivor's legacy as a historian. This is also part of his legacy. So I don't think anyone would object if we dedicate this launch this afternoon to Professor Breanne Mc Ivor. I'm pleased, yes. I'm going to get out of the way. I'm going to hand over to Jeremy Poynting, and I will be back at the end of this session to give you a send-off as we end the festival. But now, amazing scenes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Just to say that this is a launch which comes perhaps 50 years after I first made the acquaintance on paper, obviously not in person, of Seepersad Naipaul. So I came to Trinidad almost 50 years ago as a young chap with a lot more hair, a hippie drooping moustache, there are still photographs of it, on the pursuit of the writing about Indians in the Caribbean. So I came aware of the writing of Seepersad Naipaul, of Gurudeva and other Indian tales. I knew he'd been a journalist. I hadn't read any of the journalism at that kind of point. I knew he was a journalist from A House for Mr. Biswas, and that people who read the collected journalism will see just how much of Seepersad's journalism that his son lifted and put into Mr. Biswas. So you'll recognize lots of phrases. I also remember again, this is a long, long time ago, of going in pursuit of people who knew Seepersad. So, I remember going to visit Albert Gomes, or Bertie Gomes as he was known then. And Bertie Gomes was a chief minister in Trinidad. He'd come unstuck in his politics, and he'd retired with his tail between his legs to Surrey in England. But he was quite a character, was him. But he'd been an important figure in Trinidadian arts. He'd been part of Trinidad and the Beacon. And he'd also been parts of the same kind of journals as Seepersad. And he said he knew Seepersad well. The other story about Bertie Gomes was he was a huge man. and he once did a lay-down demonstration in the Legislative Council, and they had to carry him out, which was no doubt very difficult. But what he told me about Seepersad was, he said he was very warm about him. He said he was a really good writer, that his son had reduced his memory in Biswas because he was, he's portrayed as something of a failure, but he wasn't that at all. So, I started with this kind of view of Seepersad and people who'd known him. And although I'm a vicar's son and I was taught never to blow my own trumpet, I will do a little bit, because I think that I suddenly remembered this. Anson Gonzalez's The New Voices. This is 1976, a double issue on the Naipauls. And I remember finding there that there is this article by this chap called Jeremy Poynting called Journalist Dies Suddenly. And I think honestly, it's probably, apart from the contemporary reviews, it's probably the first, critical kind of article about Seepersad at that kind of time. So that's my trumpet blowing. But of course, what we're here for this afternoon is not the stories, although I can tell you in advance the stories are the second instalment of this project. But this afternoon, and I think what we want to remember is the stories and the journalism are two equal parts of Seepersad's extraordinary talent. That in his journalism, he's doing a number of things. And my colleagues will say a good deal more about it, so I'm going to shut up in a second. But the point about it is that he's establishing that great Trinidadian tradition of the journalist who is also part of the story. And my colleagues will say a bit more about how Seepersad becomes a story. He's also part of that thing where the journalist makes journalism more than just an ephemeral kind of art in terms of style and so on. He's also, and I think anybody who's interested in exploring Trinidad's past will find that his journalism is an absolutely invaluable aid to discovering the making of the place. So that when for instance, that Seepersad was the correspondent for Chaguanas, then, and I think it will tell us more about that, then, you see a picture of a community in the making and in a dynamic kind of way. But I'm going to leave it to my colleagues to start saying a little bit more. I think we start off with a reading. Yeah, we have this very, very kind of well thought out program. So what we're going to start off with is Breanne Mc Ivor, who is going to read what I think demonstrates what Ken Ramchand has to say, that in Seepersad there is a native intellectual, somebody who is thinking about his country deeply. And this first article, which is called Trinidad Needs No Port of Spain, it is precisely that kind of deep thinking about how the country could develop and has developed. So, Breanne.
Hello, everyone, and what an honor to be part of this event. Seepersad wrote in 1932 one of the earliest critiques of what he saw as Port of Spain having no idea how to make itself the capital city of a unique civilization. And this is Trinidad Needs No Port of Spain. Trinidad needs no port of Spain. But I do not mean Trinidad should be minus a capital. That would be absurd. Nor should it be inferred that I am a city hater. As a matter of fact, I am extremely city-minded. There is something exhilarating in gorgeous shops, palatial buildings, hooting cars, grumbling trams. But I think Trinidad, as essentially an agricultural country, and a rather small one as such, would have prospered better had Port of Spain been less tinged with a London or New York glamour. It is true, Port of Spain provides many people with employment by virtue of its prosperity. But it is equally true that it is drawing many away from pursuits more conducive to the prosperity of the colony. Too many people want to obtain work in town and to be city dwellers. The country laborer would prefer a city career. The small cane farmer sells his farm at short notice and makes for the town. Even the East Indian, who is stoically working the land, would, in some probability, get rid of his cow and small plot of cultivation and move into the city. As Trinidadians, we are naturally flattered whenever we are told that Port of Spain is the most up-to-date capital in the whole of the West Indies. The praise falls on our ears, a cadence of good music. And why should it not? Is not Frederick Street at least a perfect fragment of London? On the other hand, would it not have been better for all concerned if Port of Spain was just a healthy little town with no unemployment and housing problems, instead of what it is now, the most up-to-date city in the West Indies, but with the above conditions looming out, bigger and bigger every day? Thank you.
So now we're going to welcome Celeste Mohammed, who's going to read another piece which shows Seepersad's perceptiveness.
Good afternoon, everyone. Long before his famous son, Seepersad saw the perversion of democracy and the alienation of the electorate. This democracy business. Trinidad's peasants and laborers are apathetic about elections. They fear the men who seek their vote. Sunday Guardian, 3rd September 1950. What are the peasants and laborers saying about the forthcoming general elections? I spoke with the peasants in the paddy fields of El Socorro and Aranjuez, at Bamboo Settlement too. We talked as they thrust the green rice seedlings in the soft, warm mud of the paddy fields, or as they weeded their vegetable plots or tended their cattle. First, I talked with Ramsaroop. Ramsaroop is 35, thin, and, as far as elections are concerned, highly skeptical. I met him on the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway. He was on his way home from the police station, where he is dog catcher and cleaner, he said. A motor van passed by, blaring a loudspeaker and throwing out handbills. Betcha is this voting business, Ramsaroop said. He picked up a handbill and for a minute or two did some silent reading. Is not voting, he said. He had another glance at the paper, then crumpled it and threw it away. I asked, what is it? Indian picture, he said. Well, what do you think of the voting? About the voting, he asked. Yes, about the voting, I said. I don't think about it at all. For my part, I don't want to vote for any man. A little further up the road, I came upon the group who sat or sprawled on the grass at the roadside. After the heat and sweat and mud of the paddy fields, it was refreshing being here. The dry, windswept road, the soft green grass, the sweet air made them feel good, no doubt. A stone's throw away, their hut stood amid green rice. The seedlings, planted a month ago, were in places already knee-high, and the wind, moving over them, caused wide velvet waves that were exceedingly pretty to look at. When you want the peasants to tell you what they think of elections and such matters, it is bad to question them on the subject right away. If you do, they will look at you askance and take you for just another canvasser. The peasants don't like canvassers. They think canvassers are people who are out to fool them, and they are determined not to be fooled. So, I sat on the grass and chatted with the people on the prospects of the rice crop, of the okra and melongen yields, of the floods and the rains. Then we touched down on the elections. I spoke to the old man. "What do you think of the elections, Baba?" The old gentleman didn't know what elections stood for. True, he had voted once or twice, but he didn't care to vote for anybody again. It doesn't help. The man he voted for had promised to do this and promised to do that, but he hadn't done anything. His position remained the same. But why did people vote at all, he would like to know. Then we heard Rambaran, he who had just finished planting his acre in paddy. He wasn't interested in the elections either. "I don't care who get in," he said. "I know I will have to work as hard as ever for my living." Dusk found me at Bamboo Settlement. Munia was just putting grass in the pen to make fire under a heap of half-dried smoke to keep away the mosquitoes. Without meaning to be short, she said she didn't know anything about elections. So I went over to Budu Maharaj. He understood the importance of elections all right, but regretted that the people did not have the right sort of men to represent them. "You will only see them here near voting time. After voting time, you wouldn't catch them here," he said, meaning the candidates. Then Ram Singh came, and Suku, Sigulam, Basdeo, Jamarat, and Budai and others. None of them had a good word for the elections. Basdeo said, "They want us for just one day, the day of the voting. We want them every day, but after the voting, we wouldn't see them." "Water in the place for half the year," Sigulam added. "No place to tie out the animals in," said Budai. "Except the bamboo that is full of flood and full of snakes," put in Suku. "And every week the sanitary inspector handing you a long paper telling you to make pit latrine," said Jamarat. "In the water," laughed Basdeo. Thank you.
So we've just heard two brilliant readings from the two best periods, I think, of Seepersad's work, the early period in the early 1930s and the later period in the early 1950s. And I want to just talk a little bit about the process that was involved in this book and about what's in the book and what's not in the book. So I was delighted when I got the book, and I feel like it's got a great heft. When you hold this book in your hand, it feels solid. And what stands out to me with that is I think of the book almost as a gold bar. And I think of the work that went into it as a kind of panning for gold. So taking up sediment maybe from a river or something, and then the sluicing process. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So I was the one that made the little handout that most of you have. And on the front page that has the Trinidad Guardian masthead at the top, it's got a picture of a house for Mr. Biswas. And this is how I came into the story. It's very simple. I was a reader of V.S. Naipaul, as all of us are, and I loved Mr. Biswas, and I realized, wait, this is a real person. So there's a real version, a real-life version of Mohan Biswas, and it's Seepersad Naipaul. So I'd started looking for articles written by Seepersad, and I'd gotten some microfilm, and I was going through that, and I had a chance to meet Kenneth Ramchand at a conference here in Trinidad at UE in 2011. And I mentioned to him at that time that I'd started doing this work, and he was intrigued because he and Rajni Ramlakan, who's got a tribute in the beginning of the book, had been doing the same kind of work. Rajni had been going by maxi-taxi from Curep to the National Archives, day by day, finding articles, copying them out. And I was doing the same kind of thing, trying to do the same sort of work. So we joined efforts and started this process, but it wasn't an easy process. And the handout shows a little bit of that process. So the very first article that you see pictured there is his article, Dangerous Feminine Evolution, which wasn't in the Trinidad Guardian at all, but in the East Indian Weekly, which I didn't even know existed, but Brinsley Samaru and others, all the local scholars were well aware of that. And it's also interesting to see Seepersad's process as a writer. So at the beginning of Dangerous Feminine Evolution, he says very humbly, the impulse that has prompted me to write may or may not be the outcome of a writer's potentiality. In truth, I do not know whether I possess that virtue. And I think that it's really interesting to read his early work, because what you see is a lot of maybe overstated opinions and a lot of very big words. But he very quickly found his voice. So by the time you get to the articles by the pundit, when he joined the Trinidad Guardian in 1930, you see a couple of the headlines there. So, to lighten crime, shall we abolish the cutlass? And listen to his writing now, even just after a couple of years. Everybody knows that the cutlass is one of the chief implements of husbandry in the hand of the Trinidad laborer. In point of easy utility, no other tool could replace it. And because of this, if anyone were to say, abolish the cutlass, that person would be looked upon with suspicion and would be lucky if he escaped only being called a fool or a madman. But the very one who would say so, who will nevertheless agree with the writer that the cutlass, perhaps more than any other thing in Trinidad, has become a menace to society and must be considered one of the most, if not the most, dangerous weapons in the hands of irresponsible, intemperate, lawless types of people. So he's already writing with great confidence under that label, the pundit. And if you look down near the bottom, you see that he went on, and he was a great feature writer. So he'd find interesting people, interesting stories. And you see there one of his early stories from April of 1932, Marriage to an Unknown Bride. And listen to how well he sets the scene. The time, midnight. The place, Bijikal. The scene, a popular Hindu marriage. The sacred marriage ceremony is on. More than 1,000 men, women, and children surge into the spacious bamboo tent, flood-lighted by scores of torches. In the middle of the tent, on a stool hardly 3 inches tall, before a stately decoration of palms and buntings, sits the bride. So he was a master at setting the scene and doing all kinds of different work. And he was also, though, he was a little elusive. So if you look down below, you'll see a page from the newspaper from very shortly after that, in May. And down at the bottom, you see an article, Ghost Catching on the Kearney Coast, by S. Naipaul, one of the articles attributed directly to him. But up at the top of the same page, you see The Woman in the Temple by Paul Nye, also Seepersad. So he was all over the place. Marriage to an Unknown Bride, The Chaguanas Correspondent, Ghost Catching, S. Naipaul, Woman in the Temple, Paul Nye. He used a variety of different names. And you can also see there from that page with Woman in the Temple and Ghost Catching on the Kearney Coast, a lot of the articles were difficult to read, so that was a little more of the sluicing process. Even once you found an article that you were pretty sure was Seepersad, sometimes seeing what the article said would be difficult. And then the later great period that we heard another example from is pictured over on the other side of that bottom half. So They Want to Go Home. When he returned to the newspaper in 1950, he got back in doing a series of articles on a lot of different sorts of things that he'd written about before, and one of those was Indian topics. The other great thing that he did at that later period was he wrote a lot about different industries in Trinidad. So he wrote about the oil fields, a series of 5 or 6 articles, grass cutting, charcoal burning, fish farming, believe it or not, rice growing, goldsmiths, all that was in there. So those are some of the highlights of the book. And now the question comes up, well, what didn't make it in? So the short answer to that is quite a lot, because Seepersad was very prolific, and even though we probably only found a portion of what he wrote, and it's a thick book, that's still about half of what we found. So The other half we've put into a PDF that's going to be linked off of Peepal Tree's website. And I included here just one page from the table of contents of that PDF. So the supplemental PDF, if you look at that, you can see that some of the articles listed there have page numbers, others don't. So the ones that don't are the best of the best that are in the book. The others that have page numbers are the ones that you can find there in the PDF. And I'll just quickly mention three things that I think are there in the PDF that are not in the book but worth a look. The first one is a series of early poems. So like a few different writers, notable Caribbean writers, he got his start by submitting some poems to the paper. So there are 6 or 7 early poems that appeared in the East Indian Weekly. And you can see there the first one to my schoolmaster. My schoolmaster, yet wish to heaven I could get another name to distinguish such a creature. Sorry, it's a little hard to read from here. I should have opened up my book. As pollutes a master's fame. He wasn't a big fan of his schoolmaster. Another thing that you'll find in that supplementary collection are a lot more of what were called the neediest cases articles. So in the middle of his career, he was working for the Guardian in the early 1930s, and through a series of events was not working there then for a while, but came back in the early 1940s, and at that point none of the articles in the newspaper hardly were attributed at all. But we know that he was part of this annual Christmas fund drive for the neediest cases. So we've included a dozen or so of the best of those articles in the book, but in the supplement there are about 80 more. And Seepersad was an absolute master at running an annual fund drive. And you'll see there one fun section was when he played auctioneer in the newspaper, auctioning off a pearl ring that had been donated. Last bid, $200, gentlemen. Anyone anything higher? Come on, make a good offer. Buy a treasure at a bargain, help a worthy cause. Who says $250? Last chance to make your offers. So he did a lot of those. And then the last thing, again, are those different articles on Trinidad industries and other features. So you see aged Indians, patiently await ship for home. S. Naipaul tells about serpents in Trinidad, an article on snakes. Got a cough? Why not try bush medicine, he says. And then the last one that I've included here, which is in the book, it's the very last article he wrote, I wanted to put here just to make a final point about Seepersad. So his final article before his life was cut tragically short by heart troubles was Electroplaters to the Rescue. And I think this becomes a really fitting metaphor for Seepersad's work. I admire many things about Seepersad. V.S. Naipaul said that my father was a profounder man in every way, and I have a lot of thoughts on why that is, and would love to say more about that if I had a chance. But I love that he was kind of our man on the ground. He went everywhere, he saw everything. Every person that he met, you feel from his stories, was an important person to him. And he treated all of them with respect, even though he had a great sense of humor. And every story was a great story once Seepersad got his hands on it. So electroplating, I think, becomes a great metaphor for that. It doesn't matter how tarnished or dull or dingy the subject matter, Seepersad Naipaul could electroplate it. Thank you.
Okay, Professor Eastley didn't introduce himself.
Oh, sorry.
So this is Aaron Eastley, who from Brigham Young University, and one of the, as he says, one of the kinds of key editors of the. I've got a question for you. I mean,
Sure.
Obviously the book is Seepersad Naipaul, but I think it's clear from the introductions in the book that he didn't come out of nowhere. Although on the one hand he's very much a self-taught man, he comes out of a kind of an intellectual climate of other people who are around at the time and through whose kind of influence and kind of work, he arrives at a position. Do you want to say a word or two about some of those other people? Very briefly.
very, very briefly. All right. Yeah. Well, and there is more on this. So this is something that I wrote a little bit about, and that I remember having a number of conversations with Brinsley Samaru talking about this topic. The whole group of people there at the East Indian Weekly. So Chandra Bahadur Mathura was probably the most important kind of ringleader figure, but this is something that stands out to me, especially the comparison to Mohan Biswas. I love the scene in A House for Mr. Biswas where Mohan Biswas gets his first job, where he approaches the editor of the paper, and they have this fun back and forth conversation. It's a very jokey conversation, though, and when Biswas says that he's written a lot, he hasn't. But the real Seepersad Naipaul had. He'd been writing for the East Indian Weekly, and so he was an intellectual. He was very well read, and so he had a few of the faults that all of us have, I think, when we're first starting out as writers. Not a lot of confidence, and that made him, I think, maybe overblow a few things. But he was absolutely a sophisticated thinker.
Yeah, and he's part of that kind of growth of consciousness. So he admired people like Adrian Cola Rienzi.
Yes.
Rienzi, tried to tutor him in forward thinking and so on. So he is part of a climate that's going on.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think we need to move on. So what we have next is David Sammy, who's going to read us. I mean, one of the key things about Seepersad is he has an eye for eccentricity, oddity, and the kind of things that people like to read about. So David is going to read something about Trinidad's most notorious man.
Trinidad Guardian, 12th of June, 1932. Green-eyed jealousy made this man kill the only woman he loved, hack a man to death, sever the right hand of another, and deprive a 16-year-old youth of an heir. To cap all, this jealousy-stricken parricide, rather than expiate his crime on the hangman's rope, very nearly cut his own throat. And below is the full story. Port of Spain, San Fernando, Venezuela, Buenos Aires, everywhere he went, his name was anathema. But in spite of all his past notoriety and bohemian ruggedness, yesterday when I spoke to him, he impressed me before I had heard his tale as one of the homeliest men I had ever seen. I am telling you about Birbal Wilson alias Cutthroat, the man who 16 years ago, in one mad hour, deprived himself of the only woman he really loved. Wilson is 60. He was born in Tunapuna. As he himself told me, he was Trinidad's worst man. One of the most remarkable things about him is that he has a hole in the middle of his throat and an ominous-looking scar across his face. This hole in his throat is the grisly memento of the 16-year-old tragedy that crashed like a thunderbolt and smashed his life. He cannot utter a word unless he covers the punctured part of his throat with his finger. And even then, the words come out accompanied by a sort of throat noise similar to an inflated football that has suddenly sprung a leak. Cutthroat paused for a moment and flicked the ash from the tip of a half-spent cigarette. Will you believe me, he said, that I have actually killed 2 people and injured for life 2 others, and to end it all, I tried to take my own life? He continued, it all happened years ago. I was only 30 years of age and I fell in love with a girl whom my father didn't want me to marry. I used to live at Chaguaramas then. For a time, I resolved to do as my father wished. Then I found life intolerably lonely without her, the girl I loved. The earthly paradise of tropical color and warmth ate into my young life at Chaguaramas, and under the clear moon of the night, I broke the vow to my father. We were married, and I eloped with her to Caroni. Having her, I felt I had the dearest treasure on earth. And then, one day, when I least anticipated it, the unexpected happened. Returning one evening home, I saw my young wife sitting on the lap of another man. My native spirit blazed into a fury, and I picked up a cutlass and flew at them. I hacked both of them, severed the hand of another, and cut off the cutlass the ears of a 16-year-old boy. I was finally caught, but I narrowly escaped the hangman's rope. I was sentenced to life imprisonment, 20 years. I had served 9 years when, on the historic visit of the Prince of Wales, the prison authority recommended me for a free pardon. And that is how you see me here today. I shuddered as I left this man with his thin finger over the hole in his throat and with a heart so full of agonizing memories. I see I have a next piece also to read. This is not as dramatic. Sadhu prays for Trinidad. Heat, penance for sins, Trinidad Guardian, 23rd of March, 1932. Many people have been coming to the bank of the Caparo River, near the Caparo Bridge, Chaguanas, to watch an old Hindu ascetic, naked but for a single loincloth and iron chain around his waist. The sadhu is doing penance before a blazing pile of logs while a broiling sun beats on him from above. He is praying for the sins of the people of Trinidad, and he hails from the wilds of the Gomartin, Port of Spain. Sadhu Dhuni Das, for that is his name, besmeared with wet ashes from the tip of his long, unkempt hair to his toes. His eyebrows and eyes look as if they had been dumped in a paste of ashes. Silent and mute, like a figure carved out of a cake of molten ashes, the sadhu sits legs crosswise, apparently impervious to stings of sun or fire, manipulating a string of wooden beads, the while a prayer with every bead. And devout Hindus come from far and near, bow their heads to the man of ashes in holy reverence. They take a pinch of the ashes for a blessing and a penance for many ills. Others stop and watch. Everybody speaks, but the sadhu is silent and inert.
Thank you very much, David. That was brilliant. Okay, can I introduce you now to Nivedita Misra, just in case she doesn't say who she is, who has done some quite sterling work in the development of this project. Because there were the kind of intellectual things of making choices, but there also was a lot of hard work in documenting things and compiling lists. And I feel that Nivedita, you ended up doing a lot of it. I don't know why.
I think it was a combined effort of everybody, yes. With each of us contributing to our best of abilities, because it needed that kind of archival work that goes in. So my piece is just a coming together of his portrayal of women. So here it goes. Development is not a word that I like to use for literary geniuses, but I invite you now to continue on your journey that saw Seepersad transform from being a highly opinionated, confident youngster to a journalist, to a writer. And the theme I have chosen is his writings on women. In one of the very first writings available, Seepersad speaks about the beauty of women and against their westernization, that is, cutting their hair short, moving out of traditional roles of the daughter, wife, and mother, and being independent. In a sharp reply to his piece, Adrian Kohler-Rienzi reprimanded him, pointing out how he himself had adopted Western wear and attitudes. It was something that must have sent Seepersad into a deep rethink about his views on women. Given the times, Seepersad could be forgiven for having expressed such lopsided views on women. But what is interesting for me was the way that he portrayed women in his journalism. There is no trace of patriarchy. This makes me wonder if his initial writing had been a reproduction of something that he might have read, since Victorian pamphlets about womanhood were no doubt in circulation as well. Rienzi's piece would have told him to open his eyes and look around the real women in his life. In his journalism, we come across some amazing portrayals of women who have long outlived their husbands. There's a Mrs. Eleanor Ray, who was a keeper of her husband's coin collection. Quote, "This is a peculiar plight of Mrs. Eleanor Ray, a Shagwana's widow who would have rather borrow a shilling from a friend than spend a single coin of her collection because of the old age and of a family sentiment attached to them." There is a Mrs. Charles Eugene, whose love for her husband did not wane even though he was convicted for murder. He writes, "Distance and prison bars have not lessened the widow's affection for Calendar. Whatever people say, however much they whisper about him, I shall stand by him because I believe in him. Neither distance nor time will make me forget him," she told me. There are some forward-thinking women, such as Mrs. G.E. Ramsaran, who became Trinidad's first woman barrister at law, and Dr. Stella Abid, who returned from England qualified as a doctor. He reported on a banquet hosted in honor of Dr. Abid, but more interestingly, he wrote a follow-up article where he stated how he had not been asked for dinner, and this proved to be a boon because people had fallen ill after eating at the event. There is also an older Mrs. C.P. Lee who lovingly recalled Charles Kingsley riding a mule truck, and the brave Mrs. Kunj Bihari, who resolved to find her husband's killer. Trinidad may have forgotten about Kunj Bihari, she said. The police may try to forget all about him, thinking the mystery will always be a mystery. But I have not forgotten, nor will I forget. My husband was murdered, cruelly and deliberately murdered, and I have made it my life's mission to hunt down the man who deprived me of my husband and my children of their father. The fortitude and courage of the victim is reported as gustily as Sister Mary Gertrude Johnson, who presents a paper on beekeeping. He writes, to a question, "What is a beehive?" She had only one answer. A colony of bees was a wonderland, a paradise of insects, an Arcadia where all was harmony, where labor was equally divided, where all were connected with community life, where none were oppressed or ill-treated, provided they contributed their quota of labor. It is simply the enjoyment of the metaphors that catches Seepersad and that he conveys to his readers. Seepersad also reports with much emotion on Mrs. Stewart Gregg, who valiantly helped with flood relief operations in Sidros. He writes, "People have been talking of the heroic performances of men in storm-swept Sidros, but what of the women? Were there no heroines? Yes, there were. At least I discovered one." In all of these portrayals, we see an admiration for women's activism. We also see no hint of prejudice for or against women who participate in crimes, whether it is baby Chutkan, for whom Seepersad goes hunting for a lawyer. The Honorable Gaston Johnson Casey, it is understood, has been retained to defend one of the accused, and negotiations were yesterday being made with Mrs. G.E. Ramsaran, the Indian woman barrister at law, to defend baby Chutkan, the only woman among the 4 persons arrested. Seepersad never does shy away from reporting on the number of women or the extent of their participation in the rioting that follows election results. So 3 women named Georgiana Raphael, Petty Hart, and Vio Castillo, and a man named Gerald Clark were described by the prosecution as ringleaders. Yes, there is a whole domestic aspect of women's lives that is perhaps overlooked in his journalism that is dealt with more directly in his fiction. His reporting of family disputes in Magistrate Andre's court in the 1920s and 30s tells us that women were self-aware and ready to control and exploit the system to their advantage. Overall, the 1920s and 1930s were a time when the East Indians were beginning to organize themselves into groups, and Seepersad was there to report their activities. Thank you.
Yeah, and we can add that, for instance, from his daughter's memoir, Savi Naipaul, Akal, that Seepersad took his own daughter's education tremendously seriously, no less than his son's. Can I just ask, you've answered one of my questions, was about exactly how Seepersad wrote about women. Perhaps just the other area that you've been looking at in the book, which is about the point where Seepersad is the correspondent for Chaguanas. And a lot of the stuff seems on the surface kind of routine. Their court reports, their reports of road boards and election meetings. But a phenomenal picture comes out of them of a community in intense change. Do you want to say a word or two about that?
Yeah, sure. When Seepersad was writing about the 1920s and 30s, one has to remember that he was one of the pioneers. He didn't know what to write about. To look at society and to decide, oh, I could write about this. Oh, I could write about that. And he didn't wait for events to happen like one of this sort, literary festival is taking place in Chaguanas, so let me write about it. So none were taking place then. So what he did write about was something that he had to manufacture, in a sense. He had to think about what would be, what he could translate onto paper and what would be readable to an audience, which is largely Port of Spain. So, in that sense, he was going to the courthouse, looking up things, deciding what to choosing what to write and what not to write. Sorry, that's okay, sir. And similarly, he was going to parties, he was being invited to certain events, and he deciding what element of that party, what element of that gathering should he report upon. So, which is a very difficult task. And in that sense, he was a pioneer that we can all look up to in terms of, anybody who's starting to write and, anybody who wants to go about writing, what to write or how to develop a story around an event or around a person who strikes out. So he would be there to, go and see this person look right. So in that sense. Yeah.
Thank you, that's great. Okay, I think we're due for another reading now, so that Breanne, and this is perhaps Seepersad in his younger, slightly more prejudiced days about women, but it's a fun piece. So Breanne.
So, as we heard, Seepersad Naipaul celebrated the beginnings of women's participation in public life as doctors, lawyers, writers, and influential members of their communities. But in this piece, he was also old-fashioned, and he felt that modern trends like short hair, the lavish use of cosmetics and makeup, and the skimpiness of clothing were making women less and less like the figures he idealized. So this is on the ludicrous style of their garments. From the highly controversial, dangerous feminine evolution, even Indian girls are on the march, Bobism and whatnot, from 1928. It would appear that the latest styles exact the shortest and the narrowest cut in the cloth, and thus almost every other day one sees a novel style to which, indeed, my scant vocabulary could afford no name. The extremely modern girl, whilst playing tune with the latest developments in styles, also affords an interesting study to the observant student in human walking model of anatomical exhibition. The minimum in cloth affords the maximum exposure of the body. But, of course, this is Western, and in the words of the Honorable F.E.M. Hussein, B.A. Oxon, the westernized Indian can be excused, since, in a colony such as this, Western culture and habits are a passport to the best society. But, at the same time, is not the Indian race in the propinquity of being absorbed into the rest of the population, and thus losing its identity? Writing in the 1925 November number of the Calcutta Review, Lily Strickland Anderson refers to the beauty of the Indian woman and their unyielding tendency to modern fashion. Her observations are worth quoting here. Should an Indian woman be so unwise as to adopt the styles of Western dress, she will only succeed in making a caricature of herself. There can be no compromise between the styles of the East and West, and any attempt in that direction only leads to ludicrous failure. How much more lovely and graceful are the undulating lines of the saris, disguised in a multitude of handsome fabrics, embroidered, brocaded, woven, and shot with silver and gold threads, and running the gamut of the rainbow in pure and beautiful colors. How charming a foil for the old ivory and dusky complexions of the wearer. They have never known the constrictions of the body caused from wearing tight corsets, shoes, and garments cut in intricate and sometimes deforming lines. Their walk is free, lithe, dignified, and as graceful as a young lark in a spring wind. Thank you.
So after the description of the daring of young women, here's a brilliant piece about a woman of 88 who laughs at hard times.
Woman of 88 laughs at hard times. Wisdom of Granny Constance. If you work, you must make out. Slavery Memories, Trinidad Guardian, 10th of March, 1933. I talked to Trinidad's grandest old lady yesterday, Mrs. Constance Gravett of Xeres Road, who passed her 88th birthday last Sunday. I met her under the large spreading breadfruit tree, throwing corn from a tiny tin in her hand to her poultry. When she saw me, she put the box down and stood up. Preparedness, not astonishment, was evident. "Want a fowl?" she asked. I told her no, but that I wanted to speak to her, and she spake. Her health, considering her age, is splendid. Granny Constance was born in Barbados. She remembers when her father was a slave. She remembers the day when he came from the plantation, happy as a bird, and said he was free. That happened in Barbados. That day was some day, Granny Constance smiled reminiscently. We nailed flags all on the house to celebrate the occasion. With her first husband, she came to Trinidad and settled in South Trinidad 43 years ago. From there, she traveled to where she now lives. She has grown old with the villagers who pay their respects regularly. Her second husband died many years ago, and she was left alone with her only son to take care of the house. Hard times? Nonsense! The dark, shining eyes of Granny Constance, as she is more popularly known, flashed brighter. I hate to hear them tush, she said. Some people will grumble even if they live in heaven. One good walk is better than 1,000 excuses, is what I say. And the large-boned woman shifted her position on the potato box and leaned back against the breadfruit tree which she had planted with her own hands. No longer is she the willowy girl with flashing white teeth who worked in the sugar fields picking up canes in the old colonizing days, but she still fights her own way and despises talk about hard times. Are times any harder today? She cannot understand why people complain of one period being harder than another. If they work with all their strength and ambition and don't see why they can't but make out well. If they don't come rich, well, they're going to still be happy anyway, philosophized the grand old lady. Now we have the odd story of a clutching hand, broken teeth in Chaguanas, Trinidad Guardian, 11th of March, 1933, Seepersad Naipaul. A moonlight walk involving a little jealousy, broken saucers and broken teeth, which in the end proved no teeth at all, had a spicy sequel in the courthouse here and cost Marjorie Ford and Lionel Richards 25 shillings each. Told in one chapter, this is how the story ran. Marjorie Ford, Venus de Freitas, Lionel, and Edward Richards were accused of fighting. The magistrate dismissed the accusation against Venus because it was proved to the satisfaction of the court that Lionel Richards and Marjorie Ford, on the pretext of taking a moonlight walk, went and beat Venus in the privacy of her own home because they knew Edward was there, snatching halcyon hours in the company of Venus. Each of the women complained of having been attacked by the other outrageously. Ford explained that when she went by Venus's home and was calling out Edward's name, knowing him to be there, Venus pushed her hands out and struck her, knocking out her teeth. Venus did not deny this. Instead, she said to the magistrate, her teeth really fell out, your worship. I don't deny it. She wanted to bite me, and when I saw it coming near me, well, I struck at it. The owner of the teeth subsequently explained that the teeth in question were false teeth. The magistrate said, do they drop out often? Yes, your worship. Lionel, describing the incident, said, while he and Ford stood by the door calling out for Edward, he saw a big hand coming over a blind as though to grab them. The magistrate, you go to the pictures? Yes. You've seen the clutching hand, I suppose? Can you explain these clutching hand maneuvers? Lionel cried. He said the menacing hand came from over the blind and clutched Ford by her hair. It was Venus's hand. A witness describing the scuffle related how Venus was beaten in her own house and how many of her saucers used as missiles against her were broken into fragments. Edward, who the magistrate said was the cause of all that happened, said he had left Ford home, all right, and lacking nothing. He thought she should not come to trouble him at Venus. The magistrate said, a case of jealousy. Ford found out Edward was at Venus's home and said to herself, well, now I have her. And taking Lionel with her, she let Venus know her displeasure very forcefully. They went and beat Venus in her own home. You had no right to go and fight in her own home. She said Lionel kicked her. I find you both guilty for attacking that woman. Edward, who caused it all, should pay the debt. The magistrate added, speaking in particular to Lionel, you don't seem to respect the sanctity of anybody's house. Young man, take my advice and don't put yourself in trouble for anybody else.
Our next speaker doesn't need introducing, so Ken.
Seepersad Naipaul always had an inner need to live and act as an artist of a literary kind. In one of his earliest articles, he speculated briefly on the nature and origin of this urge. The impulse that has prompted me to write may or may not be the outcome of a writer's potentiality. In truth, I do not know whether I possess that virtue. Remarkable about Seepersad's writing is that he starts off writing English in a very stilted way and trying to use big words, but as he developed, he brought his writing more and more in line with his speaking voice, with his natural speaking voice. He died thinking that the artist in him had not had its say. He wrote to his son in 1950, 2 years before he was going to get sick and then die. This is the time I should be writing the things I so long to write. This is the time for me to be myself. When shall I get that chance? I don't know. 2 years later, he was about to let go. He said that the Guardian was killing him out with work. Whole day, and then he had to come home and write and so on. Sending him on all kinds of missions like, what is the price of saltfish next week? Things like that. He really chafed against the kinds of articles they were sending him to do. Literary work is a matter of single devotion. I can produce a novel in 6 months if I had nothing else to do. So now, he wants VSN to come home and write. With a breaking heart, he tells VSN, and he tells VSN what is really the story of Seepersad's own life. I doubt that you will ever be satisfied with a mere job. I know nothing else will make you happy. I mean, nothing but literary success will make you happy. Well, Seepersad did not fail. He began, you realize there are no jokes in all of this, eh? He began with poems in the East Indian Weekly. They are not the poems of a prodigy, but what we notice about them is that they are autobiographical. They are about his own sufferings and his own longings. He's battling with personal stresses, the heartlessness of a schoolmaster, his longing for love and a sense of home, a romantic desolation over lost and unrequited love, and a dependence on wealthy relations and the burning humiliations he has had to bear from them. These personal feelings and later ones about domestic dissatisfactions turn up in his landmark short story collection, the self-published Guru Deva and Other Indian Tales, 1943. And the most personal and perhaps the best stories in that collection is Gopi, which is Seepersad's version of It Happened on a Train. And then married man, 2 children, bored to death, meets this slip of a young thing on the train. He doesn't meet her, he just sees her sitting in the same carriage with her. And a whole set of very nice fantasies occur. He can not rude. He confessed to his son Vidya that Gopi was himself. I am Gopi, trapped, a bereft and palely loitering figure, sensuously drawn by female beauty, and with a soul yearning for freely chosen love and intellectual companionship with a woman. In the house of Mr. Biswas, who is Seepersad, complains a lot about getting married cat in bag. And as you know, the novel is based upon Seepersad Naipaul's life. A decade after publishing Gurudeva, Seepersad was well into his primary writing activity as the Guardian's Chaguanas correspondent. In these articles, he creates a real but imaginary country that allows us to speak of Seepersad Naipaul country in the same way that we speak of Faulkner country or Thomas Hardy country. This imaginary landscape was the writer's place, and its people were the writer's people. He wrote about all the regions and the islands' ethnic groups in their own voices and in their intimate settings in such a sensuous way and such a comprehensive way that Seepersad country is even more of a microcosm of Trinidad than is his son's Miguel Street. That might sound heresy to some, but I think Seepersad's Naipaul country was a microcosm of Trinidad, and I think it has more depth and affection and empathy than Miguel Street. Of course, Miguel Street is better written. But Seepersad was not a bad writer. That's the burden of what I'm saying here. Many of his journalistic articles, he said he wanted to write fiction, right? But many of his journalistic articles are short stories in disguise. In his Guardian columns, he palmed off on his editor virtual short stories, near short stories, real short stories. He turned his court reportage into dramatic sketches. He turned his interviewees into first-person narrators and had them move and talk like characters in a novel. He once wrote to Vidya, if you're writing about a character, you have to become the character. And this is what he did and suffered in his columns. He identified with the world's most notorious man. He identified with the sadhu who was doing penance for the sins of Trinidad. He took all of this on him in the guise of writing articles. He was a master of the alluring title. He was clever enough to make you think that what was a precise piece of descriptive writing was going to be a tantalizing tale. So he headlined a description of a Hindu wedding, "Marriage to an Unknown Bride." But it's just a charming description of a Hindu wedding. He hit them with another one, "Muslim festival to replace carnival in Chaguanas." This was just a report that the carnival bands were behindhand in their preparations for Carnival. And that year, Eid was falling on Carnival Tuesday. So, Muslim festival. He's such a good writer and observer, picking up things that he never even thought about. His writing generates such spontaneous symbolism that his last article, a description of the beginning of an electroplating industry in Trinidad, becomes a wistful expression of the dream of beginning again. Seepersad's artistic sensibility and his devotion to the art of fiction entered his journalism at will, because he was all the time writing short stories as a sideline. He transformed journalism in many ways, and this was one of the contributions of the artist. His first article as the pundit was entitled How to Read Your Guardian, and in it, he saw journalism as a form that included all other literary forms and covered every aspect of life in society. About 150 years later, theorists of literature would begin to blab about the overlapping of genre about the collapse of genre boundaries and the breakdown of distinctions between types. Seepersad was wiser than them. He was not talking about breakdown. He was talking about the overlapping. The man belonged to a fusion society, and he was writing a fusion literature. The fever of his campaign for a writing life, which would be sanctified by publication in England, burns throughout a 3-year conversation conducted with his precocious son. The letters are like entries in a journal, preserving Seepersad's day-to-day thoughts and concerns. They are journalistic in the sense that he's giving news, the video, about what's going on in Trinidad, but the letters are the heart and soul of an epic correspondence about home, family, and the means and meanings of the writing life. It is a technically advanced handbook about the artistic process, artistic devices, and about the artist's encounters with the muse. The letters join the short stories and the articles in amazing scenes as a monument to a public intellectual, cultural historian, and enduring artist, a uniquely Trinidadian man of letters. But I'm going to stop there and hope that Jeremy will ask me something that will let me say a little bit more.
Actually, Ken, I'm not going to do that. Because I think we're beginning to run a little bit out of time. Just to add to what you're saying, to be very brief, I think one of the impressions Ken talked about Seepersad as being the scribe of Chaguanas, and of course he was. But I think it's very important to stress that he wrote some excellent articles about Calypso. He wrote a brilliant piece about early steel band. All of that's there. So, he, as a public intellectual, although he grows up in an Indian Trinidadian community and remained, I think, a Hindu all his life, he's somebody who spreads his interest into the whole of the society. And I think that's really important to say. What there isn't time to do, and you'll have to buy the book to find this out, we've mentioned the fact that Seepersad quite frequently becomes his own story. And there's one very, very serious part of that, which brought him to break down, where he crosses swords with the goddess Kali, and as the sacrifice of a goat. But you'll need to read the book to find that bit out. But what we're going to end up with now is Ingrid is going to read one of those pieces, a more light-hearted piece, about Seepersad becoming his own story, where he spends a night with frogs.
Okay, now the mic's on. Okay, it's called The Reporter's Nightmare. Guardian reporter spends a night with frogs, stormy adventure in a swamp, treetop vigil in a forest, cold and tired. Trinidad Guardian, 28th September 1933, page 3. Thrown off the pillion of a motorcycle that was bearing him citywards at 40 miles an hour from a tour of storm-swept Cedrus, a Guardian reporter spent 5 hours of a rainy night perched in a tree in a swamp in the lone stretch of Icarus forests, alone save for the companionship of croaking frogs and other denizens of the forest. "Help!" I cried, but the loud roar of the motorcycle and the noise of rain and thunder completely drowned my call. I was bumped off the pillion and came to earth with a thud. I opened my eyes, blinked, and saw blue, and blinked again. I blinked again. The world was still spinning madly, and for the first time, I felt a stabbing pain in my back. I felt dumb, stunned, and very foolish. I blinked again, then got to my feet. Rain was falling, and the cold night winds blew fitfully. My teeth chattered. In the eerie darkness, with miles of forest on either side of me, I cast my eyes in the Stygian gloom, looking for a human habitation. There was none. I was hungry, cold, and tired. Add to this the irresistible human craving for nicotine. My cigarettes were wet. Music, it is said, soothes the savage breast, but not the music of croaking frogs, I think, nor the jarring click-click of water beetles. I went and leaned against a tree. I could not remain standing there. I was not only looking, but feeling very much like a wet chicken. Woodlice and whatnot creeping all over my skin. I writhed, I was feeling colder, and swarms of mosquitoes were dancing on my face and hands and singing their discordant chants in my ears. Suddenly, there burst forth a series of vivid flashes of lightning, accompanied by loud peals of thunder. The rain fell in torrents, and the wind blew in gusts. I had just finished saying, "O death, where is thy sting?" when a flash of lightning, more vivid than all, showed me a low-spreading palmetto tree that stood a little distance away from the edge of the forest. I decided to go under the tree for shelter. I crossed the drain and had barely entered the forest when I found myself knee-deep in water. A thing like a water snake slipped under my foot. I jumped. A branch on which I was resting gave way, and behold, I found myself sinking. There was a tree near me with low-hanging branches that reached down to my head. I clutched to this, and with what appeared to be superhuman effort, I succeeded in climbing on top of the tree. There I squatted for hours, while rain fell in torrents, lightning flashed thunder rolled and the winds blew fitfully. I must have been perched there for I know not how many hours, when the splutter of a motorcycle assailed my ears. By its beat, I knew it was my late companion looking for me. I called out repeatedly at the top of my voice, but in the wake of the noise of his machine, of deafening thunder and roaring rains, he did not hear me. He passed and repassed, then went away. I remained on my precarious seat, trembling and blinking like an owl.
Thank you so much for that reading. We have to wonder whether that actually happened or not, I think. Do you want to put it again?
I don't think I'm misinterpreting him. Nicholas had told me a little earlier that as we are the last event, nobody's going to push us off the stage if we wanted to have a little discussion. All we'll have to do is pay for the extra electricity.
We can go for a few more minutes. We don't have to end at the dot of 5:30.
A few more minutes for discussion.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, I think that what we should do at this point is to end this in a traditional way, which is to throw this open to the audience for any questions they'd like to raise. Before we do that, perhaps we ought to say, perhaps I think you should give all our readers a big round of applause. And I think what you will notice from that, they were all brilliant, but Seepersad helped them. He wrote such good sentences that they were good to read. So I think that's the thing. Anybody like to ask a question? I can see one there. Where's the mic?
Amazing session. I have one quick question. I know in the letters between a father and a son, I got the impression over several letters that Seepersad was repeatedly asking his son, could you send my short stories, could you send my writing to the BBC? Is there any way that you can get me published? And the response kept coming back. It was like, I guess in modern day it would be gaslighting, where VS basically said, I'm sure you'll get published, don't be so impatient, Dad. Is there a suggestion that actually he didn't help his father as he ought?
I think perhaps Ken will add to this, but I think what has to be said here is in fact that Seepersad had no problem whatsoever in getting his stories published in the BBC Caribbean Voices. Henry Swansea, the editor of that programme, really rated him very hard. I think the issue may have been more about whether VS helped him towards a publisher rather than the BBC. So the BBC was open door for him all the time.
It's not the nicest story to relate. That Seepersad went to a lot of trouble to type up all his stories, and he sent a manuscript which he expected Vidya to get published. Now, he's not a literary agent, so there's no guarantee he can do it. But at the time that was happening, he was struggling with establishing his own career. And I think he chose to spend more of his energy trying to get himself published than dealing with Seepersad's stuff. He even told Seepersad he can't pay to have it typed up, right? So Seepersad had to have it typed up down here.
Yeah. Okay, I can see another question.
So this is a question which is really partly for Ingrid, or mostly for Ingrid. So Ingrid, in your novel, the women of Boise sing, you have Lost Love Songs. That's the right title. You have Seepersad Naipaul interviewing or appearing writing stories about Boise Singh. Are those purely fictional, or are those based on real stories?
So I'm a fiction writer, and I couldn't resist the urge, because I knew about this work that was being done. I couldn't resist the urge to sneak in a reference to Seepersad Naipaul, and to the fact that he, to my knowledge, you guys can correct me, but he never wrote about Boise Singh.
No, that's true.
But he was very ubiquitous, so it's quite plausible that he could have ended up where you sent him.
It perhaps never got published. Yes. Any more questions? I think we're very near needing to wind up.
I have a question for Professor Ramchand. I wanted to invite his consideration of, in conjunction with the letters between father and son, and of course today's launch, whether in fact in the post-colonial society of Trinidad at the time, and I think Professor Samaru would actually be of great relevance here, that for many of the, particularly the immigrants to the society, first generation, or not just the first Asian, in particular immigrants, that their acquisition of literacy and fluency in the language was actually imbibed chiefly through reading the daily newspapers. And in fact, I have vivid memories of immigrants reading, or at least an immigrant reading newspapers, the Trinidad Guardian at the time, hand in hand with their native dictionary to translate from the English to their native tongue. And that is in fact this sort of first-hand and only immediate concept or mechanism that they use to acquire fluency in a language also gave pride of place to how important the colonial and at times the media at the time shaped the literary traditions, the perspectives. And this would also be relevant in terms of organs such as the East Indian Weekly, the Gazette, the Trinidad Beacon, and all these other publications. And that really was the beginning of a very nascent sort of literary nativist literature, as we see, and as one of the panels in this festival focused on the importance of journalism. I'd like to invite Professor Ramchand's thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a complicated, or a long question, for a long answer. But I'm not going to give a long answer. What I'd say, and if I get very, very specific, it will get even longer. But what I could say is that in the late 19th century, a newspaper for Indians, partly written in English, was begun. And from that point, right down into the 20th century, there were ephemeral magazines written in English for specifically aimed at Indian people. And many of them were practitioners of a kind of English, although they were not writers of English. That is why when we got universal adult suffrage, there was a very serious attempt by the Legislative Council to deny Indian people the vote by saying that you will only get the vote if you were literate in English. And then the Indian intellectuals who were writing in a magazine called the East Indian Monthly mounted an island-wide campaign in which they were assisted by other ethnic groups to get the colonial office to reverse the decision of the Legislative Council, which they did. So there was a lot more English being spoken among Indian people than is recorded. And what is recorded supports the theory that a lot was being spoken. I don't know if that gets anywhere near to what you've been asking.
Yeah, just perhaps to add to that, I think it's worth stressing that when Seepersad Naipaul was recruited to the Trinidad Guardian, it was very specifically for opening that paper up to the Indian community, Indian money, Indian advertising. I mean, I don't know whether anybody's done any research on just how widely the Trinidad Guardian was circulated, but it certainly seems like the first time that the activities, and there's loads of stuff about festivals and things in the journal, became available to the rest of the population. You know, so those articles are important about opening up the Indian Trinidadian world to the rest of society.
Yeah, for sure. Seepersad and Gordon McDermott, the editor of The Guardian, raised the number of people who were reading The Guardian. Whether the increased number included plenty more Indians, I'm not sure. But certainly the people in Port of Spain and the urban areas enjoyed Seepersad's writings. And in that way, they became familiar with Indian village life and Indian thinking and so on.
I think we probably need to wind up now. So I think what I really want to invite you to do is to give a big round of applause to the excellent editors of the book. And the brilliant readers of the book. And perhaps a big round of applause for Bocas for making this such a highlight.
Thank you, Jeremy. And again, thank you to all of you. I also want to say a very special thank you, which I neglected to do at the beginning, which is to the Trinidad and Tobago Association for the Hearing Impaired for providing this translation. So please, let us thank them. This is how you do it, everyone. Our thanks to you. And I mean, this is a book you all need to buy. This book is a classic, right? It was a classic. The material was classic material before it was published, and now it exists in two colors. Two covers, between two covers. Also in two colors, black and white, right? You print in black and white. You can tell I'm a bit tired. However, I don't want to leave the stage without saying two things. One is book-related. One is we are very much looking forward to Seepersad's fiction. So I hope you all are not going to make us wait too long. And directly addressed to Ken, please don't make us wait too long for your collected essays, a project that I know has been underway for a long time, and which Jeremy Poynting is trying to extract from you. Don't let that join the unfound literature of the Caribbean, please. Once you're done with Seepersad, please bring out your own book. Please, don't make us wait too long. And we... You have a specialist Naga at home. Let us give a round of applause to the person who will probably actually make it happen, who is David Ramchand. But again, thank you to all of you. Thank you to the readers. Thank you to the editors. Thank you to Brinsley Samaru, wherever he is now, for the work he did in making this book possible. Thank you to all of you for coming to this event, coming to the festival, buying the books, sharing time with the authors, listening to them, hounding them to get the book signed. Don't forget, you can buy books year-round, not just at the festival. Writers are writing and reading all the time. We look forward to seeing you at the Writers' Center, the year-round home of the Bocas Lit Fest, where we do events all year round, and we very much look forward to seeing you at next year's festival. Make the date now, end of April 2025. It'll be our 15th festival. Thank you for coming, and I'm going to see you there.